Today we'll look at the topic of sports, women, and the gender order. So what do we mean by sport and the gender order? There's a few things or concepts that we need to unpack in order to address this topic. First of all is what is the difference between sex and gender? And although these terms are often used interchangeably, it's very critical that we understand that there is a difference between these two terms. Sex is biological, right? It is the biological, chromosomal, genetic makeup of a person. In our society, we often see this in a binary, as in you are either the male sex or the female sex. In all honesty, and although this gets into larger topics, there actually is a spectrum between male and female. And this makes sense because if you think about all the possibilities, genetically, chromosomally, hormonally, there is not always a clear-cut way to say that, yes, this person is 100% female or 100% male. In fact, Mother Nature, biology, whatever you want to call it, is rarely so simplistic. And so we actually do have much of a spectrum within the sex realm, and anyone who would fall within that spectrum would be considered intersex. But within our society, we often see it as just male or female. And that poses a number of issues for us, a number of problems that arise, especially in the sporting realm, where we divide sport along sex lines. Now, gender is very different. Gender is a sociocultural construction of one's identity, right, of one's self. So gender is essentially the characteristics, in many ways, that we assign to a sex. So you could be a female sex, but have gender characteristics or feel that your gender is not aligned with traditional notions of female sex. Okay, so for example, if you are, think of whatever stereotypically female characteristics are out there. So if you are assigned female sex at birth, plus you align yourself with certain aspects of the female gender, that is your sense of yourself, okay, then you would have both female sex and female gender. But that's not always the case because, again, gender is a spectrum, and because gender is a sociocultural construction, there's a lot of fluidity in that range. So we do need to be careful about using these terms interchangeably, and you'll notice even at times, even I will make mistakes and use them in that way because it is such an ingrained part of our culture that they're just the same thing when they really are not. So that's something that we've got to really keep that in mind as we go through. Now, what do we mean by the gender order? So, sex is biology, right? There's, if you are assigned female sex, if you're assigned male sex, all right, we know that there's a hierarchy within our society. We are a patriarchal society. The male sex is higher on the sex order than the female sex. Now, what do we mean by gender order? Now, gender order is different, right, because this is a sociocultural construction. So what we mean by gender order is that there is a hierarchy within gender expressions, okay, and that sense of oneself. So, for example, you might be male sex and male gender, right? But not all men who consider themselves the male gender express that in the same way. And so there's a hierarchy there, right? So if you take that spectrum again, if you take the most extreme, man's man, right? And then you look at all the different types of masculinities that go from that most stereotypical male, right, and then move through the spectrum, right, you know that there is a hierarchy there, right, that men who display any characteristics that would be considered or associated with feminine gender, all right, whatever they might be, sensitive, emotional, interested in cooking, interested in childcare. I mean, that's why we have these ridiculous terms like nurses for male nurses, right? Because that's establishing that gender order. So we have that all the way from the most extreme man's man to the most extreme feminine female, right? And there's that spectrum. And so within that spectrum, there is an order. And that is a lot of where our experiences, especially within sport, because it is divided along sex lines, where they are influenced and fall. Now, I know this picture is probably pretty extreme, but it actually comes from the ESPN Bodies magazine, which I encourage you to take a look at if you haven't before. We did mention it in the media section, but it is a variety of athletes who are posed almost nude for the magazine, and it is to celebrate sporting bodies. But there is a big difference, again, in the way that male bodies are portrayed and female bodies are portrayed. We'll take that at another time. But one of the key concepts that we need to look at here with regards to males in particular is this idea of hegemonic masculinity. And hegemonic masculinity is, in a sense, that dominant version of masculinity that is accepted within our society. So these men are actually a perfect image of it. They're rugby players, they're strong, they're fierce, they're physically large men. And so they are essentially the epitome of masculinity, right? And that's what we mean by hegemonic masculinity. And within that idea is that there's no room for a spectrum. Okay, so this is essentially the top of the gender order, and there is no room to deviate. And what we find in sport is that it often reinforces notions of hegemonic masculinity, those most extreme forms of masculinity. And that's why within certain sports, we see hierarchy amongst players. We might even see hierarchy amongst sports. So the more masculine sports are at the top of the heap, where any sports that are considered less masculine or even to some extent feminine are going to be much lower. Now, how we construct hegemonic masculinity is very interesting because, again, these are sociocultural constructions, so where did they come from? It's not like we came out of the box knowing that the most important form of masculinity was being this extreme version of a male. But over time, we as a society begin to value certain aspects, and we have come to value, especially through sport, power and performance and extreme displays, right? Extreme displays of those things, extreme displays of bodies, and they have come to take on this special notion. And so sport further supports this idea of hegemonic masculinity, and anything that doesn't fulfill that role is seen as lesser. Now, is there more than one type of masculinity? And this is one of the places where a lot of folks disagree on whether sport can be used as a space to challenge traditional notions of hegemonic masculinity, right? So, yes, there is a lot of reinforcement, but there are also men who are participating in sports that are essentially by society considered less masculine or even bordering on feminine. And there's a place for them to be able to challenge this notion that there's only one type of masculinity. And sport can be that space that allows us to disrupt, that notion. It's difficult in sport, though, because one of the key characteristics of the hegemonic male is being athletic. So you can see how within sport in particular, much more so than in society, it's much more difficult to challenge that notion and to display multiple types of masculinity, because that element, that identity characteristic is so woven in. There are a lot of consequences as well for this quest for hegemonic status. So, it's one of those things where all males know about hegemonic masculinity, that may not use those terms, but they all know that it exists, and they all know that they're being measured. And, some men are going to be on a quest to make sure that they have that status. And so really ask yourself, what are some things that we have seen young men and older men do to affirm their status as, masculine, man's man, right? Can you think of any examples, right? There's a number of things that we've seen out there in the media, right? Whether it's hazing, it can take the form of domestic violence, it can take the form of hardest hits, it can take the form of over adhering to the sport ethic, training without end, striving for distinction, but again, all in these very extreme versions of this, right? And there are some pretty significant consequences of that, not only to the individual who is on that quest, but those individuals who are somewhere else on the spectrum. The media is, of course, a great place for us to unpack this idea of hegemonic masculinity, especially the sporting media, because it very much favors the hegemonic male. So, your top players, the players who you're going to hear most about, who are going to be most featured, are often going to be the ones who display the strongest characteristics of the hegemonic male. You can see a number of examples here. And the stories that don't exemplify the hegemonic male, it's not that they don't exist, but they tend to be more footnotes than the rule. If you are to Google men's sports in YouTube, right, you'll get this list of most extreme plays, hardest hits, best upsets. I mean, all of these traits that are aligned with the hegemonic male. You won't get things like, male athletes visits hospital and does good, because that doesn't align with that notion. It doesn't mean that the athletes don't do those things. It just means that it doesn't align with that notion. In American sport, we are very obsessed with that ideal man. Now, when we look at sporting females, it's a very different type of presentation, right? So we have to look at women from a few different angles because they have traditionally been underrepresented within sport. So we don't have as many examples of women. Now, I know for you all, you're probably thinking, what are you talking about? There's tons of women in sport. There is, but we could definitely say that they don't get as much publicity, and not as well known or well seen, and so their image is farther from our minds than the hegemonic male image. So participation is something that we need to look at, because there are certain ways that, in light of the hegemonic male, the female, right, is obscured, and so that tends to influence participation rates. So we're going to look at that. We also have to think about this idea of equality and what that actually means, right? If in sport men strive to be this hegemonic male, or they're essentially told that they're supposed to strive to this ideal, or they know that they're supposed to strive to this ideal, it wouldn't make sense for women to also strive to be hegemonic males, right? They're not males. They might have certain characteristics of the hegemonic male, but that's not necessarily something that the sport or even society is urging them to do, right? So what does it mean to truly be equal within the sporting realm? And then we have to look at this idea of power, because another part of the hegemonic male, especially within sport, is to have power, and that comes in lots of different forms. Physical power as well as kind of political power, right? So the stronger, larger males have more power within the society and within the realm of the subculture of sport, where women tend to be underrepresented in those positions because of these notions that they are so far from the hegemonic male, right? They don't have the same physical power. Even the strongest women are still perceived not to have the same amount of power of this hegemonic male. So they are underrepresented in these positions of power. And that takes the form of positions of power on the field, court, within the athletic department, and we'll unpack that too. Now, when we look at the media, we get a lot of contradicting notions about what it means to be a female athlete, and that is because the other end of the spectrum, right, from the hegemonic male, is the most feminine of females. So, being a female athlete disrupts that, right, because the most feminine of females is not supposed to be athletic, is not supposed to be strong, supposed to be dainty and feminine and weak, and emotional, all those extremes again. So what you see happen in the media is a compensation. Okay, well, how can we compensate for the fact that this woman is extremely strong and powerful, both physically and emotionally and politically? So what can we do to either tone her down and move her further away from that hegemonic masculinity, which has a lot of power, or how can we discredit her in some way? How can we soften this image? And so what we see is a number of standards of female beauty and bodies cropping up. We already know there are certain body image notions for women within U.S. culture, but those standards begin to be applied to female athletes. And this is very difficult, and we'll look at this in just a second, but it's very difficult, and women are constantly trying to define what does it mean to be athletic and be a woman, because we're getting a lot of contradictory signals and language from the society. And if masculinity is the desired component of a true athlete, then what does that mean for the female athlete, right? So when we look at this idea of contradictory terms, right? Strong but thin, firm but shapely, muscles are unfeminine, right? So the package of the female athlete has to come wrapped very specifically, okay? Because first of all, these are contradictory terms that don't make sense for female athletes. So how can you be both strong and thin as a female athlete? Well, to be strong necessarily, I mean, you can still be thin in a sense, but to be strong often means that you have bulk to you, and I don't mean just muscle. I mean, how can you be those things? How can you be an effective soccer player with tiny quads, right? Thigh gap. You can't have thigh gap and be a good soccer player. I mean, how does that work, right? Because you need strong quads, strong hamstrings, right? So to be strong but thin doesn't make a lot of sense. In fact, when we have athletes that strive for the traditional notions of feminine beauty within society, thin, that often negatively impacts their athletic performance, right? So, what does it mean to be firm but also have curves? These are things that often don't really exist together in the same space. And so when we have athletes that are highly skilled, we need to package them in a way that maintains their power dynamic within society, and that is supposedly to keep them at a lower power level. So we say they are skilled, but we also say they are sexy. So again, if you're looking at this picture, right, this is a picture of a soccer player, right? But what is wrong with this image, right? This is a highly skilled soccer player, all right, but yet we are portraying this woman as sexualized and sexy. And we're showing off different parts of her body. And in fact, this is actually not a soccer player. It is a model who's modeling soccer gear. But we see the exact same thing happening with our female athletes, is that the only way that they are accepted is to be shown as sexy and skilled. And here's a number of examples. These are a lot of female athletes that have been portrayed in a number of different ways. The focus obviously is on the body, and how do we make sense of these images, right? So taking Brandi Chastain's image, for example, when she was interviewed about why she posed for Playboy, she was saying that she was proud of her body. She worked very hard for her body, and she was happy to show it off. And that is, one view of that is that, yes, female athletes have worked hard for their bodies. We want them to be proud of their bodies, and too many women are ashamed of their bodies. We want them to be proud of their muscles and their strength. But at the same time, when you're posing for Playboy, you do also have to think about the consumption of those images. So are those images being consumed in a way that is reaffirming that, yes, women are strong, and muscles and strength is beautiful, or are they being consumed for other purposes? And so women in particular are really stuck in this notion of contradictory realms, right? Strong but thin, strong but weak, essentially. Now we do have a number of topics that we can cover within this realm of gender and sport. And when I say gender, it's not just about women's sports, it's also about men's athletics as well. We tend to focus on women because they have been underrepresented within the sporting realm, but anything that's affecting women is also impacting men. Just like we looked at that notion of hegemonic masculinity, right? That notion of hegemonic masculinity not only impacts women, but it also impacts men and their identities within sport. But given all the possible things that we could talk about, and in fact I teach a class specifically just on gender, sport, and culture, we do want to at least look at this topic of Title IX. And I want to pull out Title IX for a number of reasons. One is that it is one of the most land-breaking pieces of legislation to ever influence athletics. It is something that is typically very misunderstood. And I have seen it get a lot of bad press, and I really want to set the record straight as to what Title IX is and what its purpose has always been. So, Title IX basically states that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So, that means that anyone who receives federal funds cannot discriminate on the basis of sex. Now, it's important to note here that nowhere in there does it say athletics. It says in any education program or activity. So, the whole reason Title IX was passed had absolutely nothing to do with sport. The reason Title IX was passed actually had to do with higher education and women being denied access to college. Okay. Now, later it was applied to athletics, but originally that was not the intent. Now, that doesn't mean that it wasn't a great byproduct, but a lot of people think of it as the athletics bill or statute, and it wasn't. It was simply about education and access. Now, if you are a woman and you are trying to mandate for equality, because we have traditionally seen that women are the ones who lack equality in the sporting realm, there are 5 different areas of the law that you can use. There is the Equal Protection Clause in the United States Constitution. There are public accommodation laws. There is the Ted Stevens Olympic and Amateur Sports Act. There is Title IX, and then there is the Equal Pay Act under Title VII, which has to do with coaching, administration, and leadership. But Title IX really had the broadest sweeping change for women's sports. Now, Title IX covers a number of different things, right? It has to do with the access to higher education, which is why it was passed in the first place, athletics, career education, education for pregnant and parenting students, employment, and along with employment, tenure, because some of the first proponents of Title IX were looking at not only access to higher education, but the tenure process for female professors, learning environments, math and science access, sexual harassment, standardized testing, and even technology. And then at times, Title IX is continually being expanded to look at different spaces within our society. Now, what does it mean to have gender equity? Basically, the NCAA says that a program can be considered gender equitable when the participants of both the men's and women's sports programs accept as fair and equal the overall program of the other gender. So, what that means is, let's say we have a men's basketball team and a women's basketball team. If they would happily trade places, okay, and that would be all good, it wouldn't change anything, then that is considered equitable. I would argue that there are very few programs out there like that. So when we look at intercollegiate athletics, that's kind of the definition that we're going for. If a men's program would happily jump into the women's shoes and vice versa, and that would work just great, then we have equity. So what does it mean to comply with Title IX and have equity? There are 3 tests that a university can turn to, and high schools too, because this is not just applies to universities, although that's kind of where we're focused. There are 3 tests that a university can turn to. The first is prong 1, which is substantial proportionality. So, in a sense, are you meeting the needs of your demographic population? So, if 60% of your undergraduate population is women and 40% are men, okay, one piece is, do your athlete demographics roughly match that? Okay. The other is essentially, do you have roughly the same percentage of opportunities for men and women within the sporting realm? Okay. The second prong has to do with history and having a continuing practice of program expansion. So, do you have a history of expanding women's sports? Do you have a plan in place that will continue to expand women's athletics until you reach a substantial proportionality? And then the third prong is, are you fully and effectively accommodating the interests and abilities of your student population? So, as we know, different sports are more popular at different times. So, if there's a sport that a lot of people are interested in, are you accommodating that with a club sport or a varsity sport? Now, who is the one who decides whether you are in compliance with these prongs is the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. They're the ones who develop and implement the regulations, they manage all of the complaints, they investigate and enforce the law, they provide education so people understand the law, and they have 12 regional offices that work within this system. The U.S. court system is another space that enforces the law at both the federal and state level, and it is binding in that it creates that jurisdiction. We have seen a number of U.S. courts step in for Title IX cases, often because the power that is kind of endowed with the Office of Civil Rights is not as strong to force compliance. So if we look at the beginning of Title IX in the 1970s, it was passed in 1972 and educational institutions were given a compliance date of 1978. There were multiple attempts to weaken the law at committee level within those 6 years and all failed, and it was then assigned to the Department of Education and the Office of Civil Rights. At this time, women's sports did exist, but they were not at varsity status. Most of them were probably the equivalent of what we would consider intramurals. They were heavily funded and executed by the players themselves. In the 1980s, Title IX regulations were actually suspended for 4 years after the verdict of Grove City versus Bell. But in 1988, the Civil Rights Restoration Act was able to reinvest in Title IX. And essentially what happened with the suspended operation was private institutions in particular were saying, well, we will just stop taking federal funds and we will not have to comply with the law. And at that time, the reaction was to essentially suspend until the Civil Rights Restoration Act said, nope, at some level, everyone is receiving federal funds, private schools, this applies to you too. In the 1990s, the courts had a pretty land-breaking case during Cohen versus Brown University in which they assigned monetary damages for intentional violations. So before this, there was no money awarded to, the person who lost, but at this time after the Cohen case, you could be given monetary damages. In 1996 and 98, clarification letters were issued, and in 96, EADA provided a federal disclosure. And these clarifications were continually needed because there was always people trying to circumvent the law, and so clarifications were added to try and curtail that. In the years 2000 and beyond, we have essentially created a commission on the opportunities in athletics. In 2003, there was further clarification. In 2005, there was pretty much a clarification battle. In 2005, there was a retaliatory Supreme Court decision, which was pushed along by the Bush administration, which was used to weaken Title IX. Essentially, that third prong, looking at whether you were meeting everybody's needs, which is one of the prongs you can use to pass Title IX, they allowed email surveys. And if any of you have ever completed an email survey or quickly deleted an email survey that you saw come up, you recognize that just simply providing an email survey to students and saying, well, yep, everybody's happy, is not really adherence in the spirit of the law. And in 2010, OCR offered clarifications that reversed that decision. Now, Title IX's prong number 1. So, participation. Okay, if you take a look here, this is boys and girls participation in sports at the high school level since 1971. As you can see, they have both had an increase over time. So, if you look, right, obviously, boys' increase over time has been much smaller. So, just above the 3,500,000 line and ending close to the 4,500,000 line, okay, 30 years later. Girls obviously have had a much more dramatic increase because there were so few participation, going from under 500,000 up to just over 3 million. So, but if you look, right, again, we're talking about net gains for both men and women. And you can see that the trends are similar, right? So both men and women having a spike at roughly the same time, having drop-offs, and then having that gradual increase. There are so many people that say, no, Title IX has ruined men's sports and has cut so many athletes. There are still fewer female athletes than there are male athletes, and male athletes still have had a net gain over the years. And we have the same trends happening in college, both men and women having net gains. This is from 1990 to 2010, so obviously you don't see the stark increase in women, which would have happened earlier. But we essentially have, again, continually, steadily increasing numbers of men and women participating in sports. Net gains for both. And if we want to pull this, apart and look at it more closely, specifically by sport, you can see the sports that have increased in popularity over the years. You see probably the most dramatic increase is in women's soccer. This is occurring right around the 90s, late 90s, especially with the U.S. women's soccer team. We saw a huge increase in women's soccer. Women's cross country, also nice steady growth. Softball. And then women's outdoor track, indoor track, and golf, fairly steady growth over time. With men's sports, we haven't seen as much dramatic growth. They've been pretty consistently high in most spaces. Men's basketball probably has had the most growth of all of the sports, followed by the baseball and cross country, and then things like men's soccer, lacrosse, indoor track have remained relatively stable over time. Now, with all of this, Title IX has had some pretty amazing effects on gender statistics within sport. As of 2012, there were 9,581 varsity women's teams at the collegiate level. This is more than has ever been had. Increases of well over 200% since Title IX was passed. The most popular sports for women include basketball, volleyball, soccer, and cross country. Many schools added volleyball, soccer, and cross country to increase their compliance. Most schools already had women's basketball teams from the 1970s on. Now, we do want to examine this intersection, though, of gender, race, and participation, because for a lot of sports, Title IX meant adding women's sports. So, what sports could be added? The sports that were most commonly added around this time of Title IX and compliance throughout the years have included softball, tennis, track and field, golf, swimming and diving, lacrosse, field hockey, and rowing. And in fact, rowing has been one of the primary sports added, especially in recent years, because you can carry such a large squad that it balances out football teams. You can carry squads of 60 rowers and balance out the football numbers. But what I meant about this gender-race intersection is that if you look at the sports that have been added as a result of Title IX, you see that many of these are very much white, middle, upper-class sports. So a lot of theorists have said, Title IX did not equally impact women. It had a positive impact on women's ability to access sport, but it did not impact women of color in the same way it impacted white women. It did not impact working class women in the same way that it did middle class and upper class women. And those are just important things to recognize, okay? Because there aren't even, there's not even agreement amongst women that, Title IX was universally wonderful. It was good, but it was better for some than for others. We've seen differences in the percentages of coaching. It's important to note here that women were housed under the AIAW before joining the NCAA, so sometimes looking at these numbers is difficult because before women joined the NCAA and most athletic departments combined to become men's and women's departments, women coached 98% of their teams, and they were athletic directors of 98% of the women's athletic departments. So in one sense, what we see is a dramatic decrease in the number of women coaching. On the other hand, if we look divisionally, the number of women coaching women is almost at half. But women roughly represent 21% of all head coaches. They coach about 43.5% of women's teams, but only 2 to 3.5% of men's teams. Which is interesting because over 50% of women's teams are coached by men, and yet only 2% of men's teams are coached by women. Women are most likely to coach synchronized swimming, field hockey, riding, and equestrian, and lacrosse. And you can see if we break it up by division, this is women coaching women. Division 3 has the best gender diversity. Now, when we turn over to gender and administration, we see some very different numbers. What we saw was D1 to D3 all fairly even with regards to coaching. But when you look at athletic administration, right, Division 1 drops way down. Only 10.5% of D1 athletic administrators or athletic directors are women. And at D3 we have 30%. So there's 3 times the difference there between D1 and D3. And again, this is just a number, but why is there a difference? Why is there a difference? Why aren't there more Division 1 athletic directors who are female? Right? So if we look at the average for all divisions, around 22% of our athletic directors are women. About 36% of the athletic administrators in a department are women. And yet we still have about 11% of our universities that have no female administrators whatsoever. And that's also very telling. And just some random stats here at the bottom that 32% of head athletic trainers are women and 12% of sports information directors. So again, these are just numbers. They don't tell us anything about the qualities of their experience. They don't even tell us anything more than simply that. They are simply numbers and representations. So does it matter that 12% of sports information directors are women and that 88% are men? Does that matter? That's something that we would have to explore in greater detail. So what we're looking at here is just purely quantity. We're not looking yet at quality. With regards to prong 2, so the different ways that you can meet prong 2 is 1, looking at the history. So do you have a record of adding intercollegiate teams by sex? Do you have a record of upgrading teams to intercollegiate status, so maybe from club to intercollegiate varsity? Do you have a record of increasing the number of participants of the underrepresented sex? So if 60% of your student body is female, but only 40% of your athletes are female, do you have a history of trying to increase the number of female athletes? And then do you have affirmative responses to requests to add or elevate sports? So when people come to you and say, we've got this great club team, we want to be elevated to varsity, do you have a history of responding appropriately? With regards to the continuing practice, we're looking at current implementations of policies and procedures for requesting the addition of sports. So how do the people on campus know that they can and how to to lobby to have their sport elevated to varsity status? Is there an effective process of communication? Are the current implementation plans and programs responsive to developing interests and ability? And have there been some demonstrated efforts to monitor developing interests and abilities, not just simple internet surveys? Now, the big topic, right? Cutting sports. To cut a women's viable team, you must immediately meet proportionality. So you cannot cut women's programs without being able to prove that you can still meet proportionality. To cut a men's team doesn't have the same weight in terms of you don't need to immediately prove anything, but it is a highly disfavored practice, and it does not help a school reach prong 2. So simply cutting a men's sport and saying, look, see, now we have more women's sports than men's, that does not pass prong 2. Now, a lot of coaches, a lot of athletic directors will say, well, it's all Title IX's fault that we had to cut the men's blank program, right? Whatever it might be. There are certain sports that have been much more harshly hit by this than others. But that is not the case. There is no space anywhere in Title IX that encourages the cutting of any sports for either sex. Now, the fact that athletic directors cannot be more creative with their budgets, the fact that we put so much emphasis on football and the high number of scholarships and money that goes into football, And I'm sorry if some of you are football players, but we do put an inordinate amount of money into those teams, football and basketball, though football is much more expensive to run. That does take away money from other sports, and those are choices that are made by athletic directors. And so, when a men's sport is cut, all right, it is not because of Title IX. The point is to add women's sports to increase proportionality, not to cut men's sports back so much that they now equal women's sports. But I've heard many coaches and many athletic directors blame Title IX for the plight. The other thing to keep in mind is changes over time. So, as we saw in some of our earlier charts, not all sports are popular at all times, and certain sports fall out of favor and new ones come in, and so certain men's sports are cut and others are added. So, it's not as simple as, Title IX, threatens men's sports. It doesn't work that way. And so we need to understand that, because I think there's so much misinformation out there. Now, prong 3 is the trickiest one, because it's the most difficult to pin down, right? Is, are you meeting everybody's interests and abilities? So since, on campus, is there an interest that is not being met? Is there a sport that women are interested in that, we don't have? Is there sufficient ability to sustain a team in that sport? So, do you have the funding? Is there enough interest? Could you build a team and sustain a team over time? And the last piece is, there a reasonable expectation of competition? So if we take CU, for example, several years ago, CU added lacrosse, women's lacrosse. Okay, and I know a number of female rowers, since I was coaching a women's program at the time. A number of female rowers were really upset because there's already an established women's club team in rowing. Because rowing can carry a large squad, it is a very popular sport for balancing out Title IX numbers. And, they were really frustrated. But when it came right down to it, lacrosse is far more popular in the Rocky Mountain area. There's a number of close teams for competition, where for rowing, it's an expensive sport to run. You were going to have to travel long distances to race in anything competitive, and there wasn't the ability to sustain a team in a place that is not really rowing focused. There's only one place to row in the entire city, which is on the Boulder Reservoir, and you're basically just doing loops over and over again. It's manageable, but it is not really, in the mind of an athletic director, sustainable or reasonable. Now, if we have an unmet interest and ability, the OCR will evaluate, the following aspects, right? Was there a non-discriminatory method for assessing the interest and ability? Was a viable team eliminated? Were there multiple indicators of interest and ability? And how often were you assessing, right? Because we know that obviously every year there's a change in student demographics. So Title IX also touches on a number of additional elements, such as financial aid. And when they look at the financial aid numbers, they're comparing the dollars spent, not budgeted, on the current athletic program. So what you've done in previous years has no impact on financial aid currently. So, for example, if you take a look at this, if 60% of your student athletes are men and 40% are women, then within 1% of the various student athletes with unduplicated percentages, you'll be fine. So men need to get between 59 and 61% of the athletics aid, while women get 39 to 41% of the athletic women's aid. So you see that there's that idea to balance it out based on your demographics. Now we look at all of the smaller, not less important, but just smaller pieces of Title IX. So these have to do with things like equipment and supplies, scheduling, travel, per diem, tutors, coaches, facilities, medical, training, housing, publicity, sports services, and recruiting. And so again, when we're looking at how equal or equitable are these programs between men and women, we're looking at a lot of the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day pieces. So when we're looking at a quality equipment and supplies, we're looking at, is the equipment of quality? Is it suitable? Do the athletes have the right amount? Is it regularly maintained and repaired and replaced? Is it available, right? So you can't say that every year new basketballs are bought and they're given to the men's team and then the women get the cast-offs of the men's program, right? No, there should be an equal in the amount of quality. If new basketballs are being bought, then some should go to the men and some should go to the women. Now, the scheduling of games and practice times I've always found pretty interesting because, one, we're looking at the number of competitive events, the practice time and length. I've worked with a number of women's organizations that will be practicing, and if the men's program needs to come in, they need to vacate immediately, right? Time and day issues. So when are the events scheduled? That's another thing I've often seen where men's events are scheduled during prime time, where women's are kind of off hours. And then, the quality and the quantity of pre- and post-season competition. When we're looking at travel and per diem allowance, we're looking at the different types of transportation the athletes are given. So, are the men given a chauffeured bus while the women have to drive themselves in 12-passenger vans? Where are the athletes staying? Are they staying on parents' floors? Are they staying in a nice hotel? How long are they staying? Oftentimes we've seen for especially big D1 sports where the athletes get to stay in a hotel the night before competition, then the day after competition, where with some of the what would be considered the lesser sports within those realms are traveling all day, competing, and then sleeping, and then traveling home all night. Do we have similar per diem allowances and dining arrangements? Tutors, is essentially, do we have opportunities to receive academic tutoring, both men and women in an equal amount, and then their assignment and compensation of the tutors. So are all tutors properly qualified, have enough experience, given a relatively, similar rate of pay and a relatively similar workload? So, if we've got a men's tutor who's, got a ratio of him to 5 athletes versus a female tutor who's given a ratio of him to 20 athletes, there's a big difference there in the amount of service and the quality of service you can get. Coaching is looking at the opportunity to receive coaching first and foremost. So do you have a full-time coach? Are there also part-time and assistant coaches? Do you have graduate assistants? Looking at both the assignment and also the compensation, right? So are the coaches that you're bringing in trained and experienced? Do they have professional standing? Are you compensating them fairly and appropriately? Are you giving them similar contract durations and renewals? Do they have experience? What is the nature of their coaching duties? I mean, there's just a lot of pieces to this, right? Is that we make sure that our coaches are fairly similar across the board. Facilities is often a big piece for student athletes. This is one I hear student athletes complain about the most. Usually locker rooms, and the availability and quality of locker rooms for both men and women is usually a pretty significant point of contention. Most schools that I have worked with in the past, locker rooms are almost exclusively male domains. That are, may not be the highest quality, but they're certainly a higher quality than what the females use to change. And then we're looking at, of course, the practice and competitive facilities. So are they quality? Are they available? Are they used exclusively for the athletes? So if you have a track and that is used exclusively for your women's track team versus you're having a track where the community can use it, the men can use it, the women can use it, that can definitely impact practice times. Maintenance, is there a regular maintenance term? Is there regular preparation on the facility? Medical and training services are, again, we're looking at is that available to the various athletes during practice and games and perhaps travel? So, if the men travel with the medical personnel all the time and the women just have to borrow someone from from their visiting team, there's a difference. Do they all have health, accident, injury insurance? Are there qualified and certified athletic trainers that are available? And, do they have good quality weight facilities, training facilities, sports med, etc.? Housing and dining. I'm sure that a lot of athletes, this touches close to home. Do you have student-athlete housing, and if it is, is it equitable, or do some athletes get special services? And then in terms of dining, is the same amount of food available for the same amount of time for each athlete? And publicity, is there available and quality personnel running the publicity for your departments? Do the athletes have and the coaches have access to other publicity sources? Is the quantity and quality of the publications and other promotional materials fairly equal? And even travel issues for the purpose of publicity. Support service deals with some of the more basic aspects, but essentially, do all men's and women's teams have access to administrative assistants, secretaries, clerical assistants, office space, computers, and those elements. Recruiting is one where, again, a lot of folks are very, are sticklers for making sure that there is equity. That, are there equal opportunities for coaches to recruit? Okay, are coaches getting, essentially the right amount of financial aid and other services? And whether it's benefits, opportunities, treatment, that athletes have a disproportionately limiting effect on recruitment. So if you can't offer certain things, you really cannot recruit certain athletes. So that's why there's also a big push in this realm for consistency. Now, some permissible differences are allowed, such as recruitment, recognizing that certain sports have to recruit at greater distances. Sports like football, basketball, every town in America has those, but other sports may not be as readily available. Event management costs, certain events cost more to put on, we recognize that, right? Equipment, some equipment costs more than other equipment. Again, that really doesn't have to do with men and women as much as it just has to do with certain sports equipment is more involved and expensive, and for certain sports it's not. For rowing, buying a brand new boat is $30,000 to $50,000, right? But buying a, take a sport, buying basketballs, right, which is also equipment, not nearly the same cost. Okay? Publicity issues, recognizing again that society has different ideas with regards to publicity. Certainly college athletics, football, men's and women's basketball are some of the biggest events in the mainstream society, and so they have different amounts of publicity. Compensation, this one's a sticky one for me because I know that coaches get different compensation based on the sport, based on the going rate of coaches in those sports, etc. I still find that one really difficult to swallow. And then medical issues, because certain sports obviously are going to have a higher instance of possible of injury. Some of the emerging sports for women, especially most recently, are equestrian at the D1 and D2 level. Equestrian has actually largely been focused in the D3 level. It tends to be a private sport, a private school sport, but it's starting to take root in some of the other divisions. Rugby has been seeing a huge amount of growth within women's sports. It's been very, very popular across the U.S., particularly in the East Coast. Sand volleyball is also starting to pick up at the D1 and D2 level. And the issue with sand volleyball is you tend to have pretty small teams. You can carry a pretty small squad, so it doesn't help a lot in terms of increasing the number of women participating in varsity athletics. Triathlon has also been coming around, more of the alternative sport form that women are getting very much involved in. And then kind of the last ones go together: stunt, acrobatics, tumbling. And this is in a sense taking a lot of essentially the cheerleading aspects that come from cheerleading competitions and putting them into their own sport organization. And that's seen a lot of increase over the years. So we covered a ton of information with regards to Title IX and gender in sport, and there's so much more that we could go over, but we'll kind of leave it at that. I want you to really think about this idea of Title IX and the purpose that it serves, and really do take some time to reflect on this idea of Title IX that destroys men's sports at the at the expense of our male athletes, and really challenge folks that hold those beliefs to, well, let's talk about that a little bit more. Let's unpack that a little bit more. Did Title IX really advocate for men's sports to be cut? And then, of course, the pieces that we started with at the very beginning, which is, what is the quality of the experience like, for a female athlete versus a male athlete? And not just male to female, but also within the various sports there. So, right, not all men's sports are equal. So what is the differing experience of men in different men's sports and different women's sports? I think there's a lot there that we can reflect on. All right, next we'll be moving into sexuality and sexual orientation, and that will take us closer to the end of our identities section.